We're going to be covering the UPS controlled flight into terrain accident. My team members were Brady, Carter, Cody, myself, and Nicholas. So, our accident overview, the route was from Louisville to Birmingham on an Airbus A300-600. The flight itself was 1354, and some important notes on this accident is the fact that runway 624 was the longest runway and it was NOTAM closed only from 4 to 5 a.m. It was scheduled to arrive at 4:51. The accident occurred at 4:47 in the morning. The crew selected to do the runway 18 non-precision approach into Birmingham. They crashed short of 18 and they both were fatally injured. The airplane itself was destroyed on impact, and then there was a post-crash fire as well. All right, so just making sure this brought everything up perfect. The UPS training had less than 2 months prior to the accident. The captain and the first officer had proficiency checks and training. That was held on June 26, 2013. The training overviewed the UPS Big Six model, which included communications and briefings, which we'll obviously see in a moment is one of the main contributing factors to this accident. What if planning, time management, teamwork and leadership, automation management, which is also one of the bigger crew failures here, and situational awareness, which is also a big issue with this specific accident. All right, so the pre-flight safety briefing. Before the flight, as outlined in the Flight Operations Manual published by the FAA, the UPS uses a CRM and safety briefing should have been completed. This crew should have briefed to include the 5 items. And after the accident occurred, other UPS crew members reviewed the recordings and indicated that a check item for fatigue had not been included in the brief. So just looking at what that all included, the briefings outlined in the flight operations manual as setting a good tone and efficient crew coordination, establishing and encouraging crew communications, set expectations for standard operating procedures, stimulating good situational awareness, and reject takeoff procedures and safety philosophy fee. All right. So the dispatcher, one of the kind of the faults on the dispatcher here was that he didn't bring to the attention of the flight crew that the longer runway, which was 624, would open at 5 o'clock, which was only 9 minutes after the flight was scheduled to arrive. So the crew planned for a landing on runway 18. They're going to do the localizer 18 approach, which actually stated and not authorized at night. And Jepson stated that that was a human error. The dispatcher believed that the only approach that would have been really allowed was the RNAV 18, and the ceilings were forecast below the MDA. So the aircraft would have had to hold or divert to their alternate of Atlanta. And he didn't want to notify the crew of the limited options because he didn't want to kind of embarrass them in a way. And then he could have also notified them like for corrective actions to delay the flight by about 9 minutes, and they could have flown the ILS to the longer runway. This may or may not have changed the outcome of this accident. I think what would have happened maybe if the dispatcher had notified them, I think they would have taken the longer runway. And I think their setup might have been cleaner, and I think that might have prevented the accident from happening, but I don't really think for the most part there's any way that this was like fully the fault of the dispatcher because as we'll see, it's mainly falls really on the crew themselves for what they were doing. So the captain, he was the pilot flying. The captain created a communication barrier by not announcing his intentions to the first officer. He was switching some stuff with the system and didn't like tell her, and then she figured it out a few moments later. And he lacked situational on the descent rate and altitude. So upon the autopilot not engaging in profile mode, the captain changed to vertical speed mode without making the first officer aware. The captain essentially flew a dive and drive approach, making it more important that the crew monitor altitude, and the captain violated stabilized approach criteria. So the stabilized approach criteria was violated when descending below 1,000 feet AGL because the captain was still flying at a descent rate that was greater than 1,000 feet per minute. The captain also didn't arrest the descent at the minimum descent altitude, and upon passing 1,000 feet above ground level, the sink rate caution alert triggered, and while the captain did adjust his vertical speed in accordance with the UPS's procedures, he was not aware of how intense his descent rate still remained. And the captain and the first officer did not verbalize um, any concern nor initiate any kind of go around, even after realizing that they might have hit something. I think that one's kind of a difficult thing to think about with the crew resource management accidents here because obviously you don't hit something normally and you need a minute to register that. So I think they might have been in denial for a moment. Obviously, they realized something was not right. And kind of as we learned, if something doesn't look or feel right, it probably isn't. So I mean, if you were more prepared, more proficient, anything like that, I think in that situation, you could have figured out to make a go around decision right there. If anything else hadn't tripped you off. But again, I think kind of what happened there was the captain was in some denial that he might have just hit something, which was in fact correct. He had hit some trees and then quickly after that was when they impacted. So the first officer was the one monitoring the flight controls. Um, at the time of the accident, the first officer did not make too many primary mistakes with controlling the airplane, but rather made more mistakes by not realizing the altitudes or making her callouts for the captain. So, looking kind of exactly at which those errors were, she didn't verify the localizer approach was active in the FMC. She performed the before landing checklist at 2,500 instead of 2,300 MSL at the final approach fix without realizing it. She also didn't realize the captain had switched into vertical speed mode until about 7 seconds after. That's kind of more on the captain, I would say. Um, and then she didn't realize the approach violated the stabilized criteria that we talked about earlier. Did not call out the approach when reaching the minimum descent altitude, and confirmed the runway in sight, but not aware of how low the aircraft was on short final. So then moving on, obviously almost all of the mistakes made by the first officer were crew resource management mistakes. These mistakes could have been avoided with simple communication and resource management cross checking the instruments and the captain's control inputs. So, kind of in conclusion here, the NTSB did determine the probable cause to be the flight crew's continuation of an unstable approach and failure to monitor the aircraft's altitude during the approach, which led to descending below the MDA and striking in terrain. Major faults were the failure to properly configure and certify the FMC, and that would be on the first officer. The failure to communicate would be with the captain and his intentions when he switched to vertical speed mode because he didn't let the first officer know anything about that. She just noticed it on her own time. Failure to allow to follow standardized callouts, that's definitely on the first officer there. She should have been watching the altitude. I mean, obviously the pilot flying and the captain and herself should have been both monitoring the altitude. But had she maybe said like, we've reached our MDA, maybe they would have made a different decision. Who's to say? To go around if they realized they were below their MDA before they should have been. And then obviously performance deficiencies on the captain's part. They both obviously were a little deficient in a couple things. The NTSB didn't limit it to fatigue, but that was definitely one of the things playing into it potentially because of how early this flight was. But then, all in all, this was a failure to have effective crew resource management skills. Oh, and then our resources were just the NTSB accident report.